The Crusades were a series of wars fought in the Middle Ages, which initially began as an attempt to retake the hallowed city of Jerusalem for Christianity. For the many soldiers and knights who participated in these conflicts, the Crusades were a form of holy war that could guarantee a fighter's place in heaven. Despite their zeal, the Western Crusaders would have very few successes after the First Crusade, and the Crusader kingdoms established in the Middle East would be very short-lived. The First Crusade was called for in the 11th century, in response to a shake-up of politics in the Middle East. Jerusalem had fallen to the armies of Islam long ago, in the 7th century. Still, Christian pilgrims had continued to visit the Holy City until the Seljuk Turks' armies changed the Levant's balance of power. The Seljuks had embarked on a war of rapid expansion, causing serious problems for the Christian Byzantine Empire and visiting Western pilgrims. Struggling to contain these new invaders, the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I, a shrewd politician, turned to the Pope for aid. The Eastern and Western churches had long been at odds with each other, even excommunicating each other in 1054. However, when the Byzantine Emperor asked for help, the Pope agreed, as it seemed like an excellent opportunity to repair relations between the two churches and open up Jerusalem to pilgrims once again. The subsequent preaching of the Crusades by Pope Urban II, which took place outside the Cathedral of Clermont in 1095, is now one of the most famous events in Western history. Precisely what the Pope might have said to spark the Crusades is still disputed, but the effect was electric. According to one account, the Pope's speech moved the crowd, and he told his waiting congregation that those who fought to defend the Eastern Christians and restore Jerusalem to Christian lands would be absolved of their sins. In a profoundly religious era, the idea of holy war had strong mass appeal. By the spring of 1096, groups of soldiers and noblemen from across Western Europe had gathered together to march towards their rendezvous in Constantinople. These pilgrims sewed fabric crosses onto their clothing, signifying they had agreed to take the cross and were resolved to fight for Christendom. Among the earliest groups to reach Constantinople was a large and rowdy party, led by a charismatic holy man and mystic, Peter the Hermit, who preached the crusading cause with a fiery passion. Other early crusading armies took notable and violent detours on their way to Constantinople. One group, led by the German Count Emicho, travelled through the Rhineland, murdering Jews to the horror of local bishops who tried to protect them. Many of these crusaders also caused a great deal of trouble while passing through Christian Hungary and the Byzantine hinterlands. Those not killed by the furious Hungarians on their way through the Balkans participated in what is known as the People's Crusade, a crusade that took place before the more organised crusading armies arrived. The People's Crusade proved to be a horrifying failure, as this disorganised and reckless mob was quickly slaughtered by the Seljuk Turks once they crossed over enemy lines and began raiding the countryside. By 1097, the Crusader forces' main armies had arrived in Constantinople, where the Byzantine Emperor gave them money and support. In theory, when the Crusaders regained lost Byzantine lands, they were supposed to give them back to the Eastern Christians, although this later turned out to be wishful thinking. Several important and distinguished noblemen led the First Crusade's armies, including Raymond of Toulouse, Godfrey of Bouillon, and Beaumont of Taranto. With experienced fighting men now at the forefront, the army's main body marched out across Anatolia, recapturing the critical border town of Nicaea before fighting their way towards Jerusalem. The road to the Holy City was difficult and dangerous. When the group attacked Antioch's heavily fortified city, they got stuck in a very long siege that threatened to finish off the flagging soldiers. Plagued by food shortages, many men deserted, desperate to escape the appalling conditions, violence, and threat of starvation. Nonetheless, the Crusaders did eventually get inside the city walls. After capturing Antioch, the Crusaders finally headed to Jerusalem, which was now in the Muslim Fatimids' possession. Helped by well-timed reinforcements in the form of supplies and materials for siege engines, the Crusaders broke through the walls of the city in the summer of 1099. The victorious soldiers went into a frenzy, murdering men, women, and children without mercy. The unlikely success of the First Crusade appeared miraculous to Western Christians, who saw it as an act of God. The Crusaders would continue their martial activity after capturing Jerusalem, creating the Crusader states of Outremer, which would gradually expand. To include Tripoli, Edessa, and Antioch, these new Western kingdoms were in a precarious position. Surrounded by a Muslim majority, the rulers of Outremer quickly forged new alliances in the Muslim world to ensure their survival. By 1144, the exposed kingdom of Odessa had been lost to the Seljuk Turks. Alarmed, the new Pope Eugene III called on Western knights once again to protect the fledgling states in the Holy Land. The German King Conrad III and King Louis VII of France immediately agreed to rescue the lost Crusader state, arriving in Constantinople in 1147. Despite the new army's huge numbers, the short-lived Second Crusade was an abject failure. Nur ad-Din, one of the greatest Muslim leaders of the age, deliberately destroyed the city of Odessa, making its recapture impossible. The overconfident Western knights soon launched an attack on Damascus instead, but Nur ad-Din came to their aid, dealing the Crusader army a crushing blow. The now directionless Second Crusade was dissolved by 1148, as both kings gave up the fight. Nur ad-Din would continue his expansion program in the Middle East, taking control of of Egypt and installing one of his best men in Cairo, the talented Kurdish general Saladin. Saladin would take over after Nur ad-Din's death, proving to be even more successful than his predecessor. Saladin would soon set his sights on the Crusader states after becoming Sultan of both Egypt and Syria. The King of Jerusalem at this time, Guy de Lusignan, would ride out to meet Saladin, but he ultimately suffered one of the most brutal defeats of the Crusades at the Battle of Hattin. Saladin would lure Guy away from a secure position near a local spring, forcing him on a long march through arid territory. The Muslim army then camped between the Franks and the next available water source, distressing the Crusaders who were by now dying of thirst. The dying soldiers had no choice but to engage Saladin at Hattin, but in a weakened state they were promptly defeated. King Guy was imprisoned and released, but the Templar raiders who accompanied him and who had been a constant nuisance to local Muslims were beheaded. With the king and his army defeated, Saladin took Jerusalem easily in 1187, rocking Western Christendom. The Third Crusade was soon called in response to the significant loss, and it is particularly famous because of the larger-than-life characters who participated in it. Saladin, in particular, would come to be greatly admired in the West due to his merciful and chivalrous conduct during the conflict. Among those who answered the call were Richard I of England, known as the Lionheart for his extraordinary courage, King Philip II of France, and the great German King Frederick Barbarossa, who unfortunately drowned on the way there. Richard I would have some great successes during the war, recapturing the cities of Jaffa and Acre, and defeating Saladin at the Third Crusade's most significant battle, the Battle of Arsuf. Despite his victories, Richard's army was soon depleted, and he was inevitably forced to return to Europe to protect his interests at home. The Third Crusade's armies never managed to siege Jerusalem, and the conflict ended in a truce, with Richard leaving the Holy Land in 1192. Saladin died just a year later, in 1193. The Fourth Crusade was called by Pope Innocent III a few years later, in 1198. This time, a group of primarily French noblemen planned to set sail for Egypt in an attempt to capture the Ayyubid capital in Cairo. The expedition was led by a wealthy Italian Marquis, Boniface of Montferrat, who took the party to Venice to acquire ships. When the Crusaders received their 240 vessels, the Venetians asked for payment up front, but the Crusaders did not yet have the money to fund the expedition. The wily Venetian Doge Enrico Dandolo soon turned this situation to his advantage, asking the Crusaders to recapture the rebellious Christian city of Zara on Venice's behalf as a form of payment. The Western Knights complied with this request, sacking the city in 1202. The appalled Pope was so outraged, he excommunicated everyone involved. But the Crusaders soon took on an even bigger commission. The Byzantines had recently deposed their Emperor Isaac II Angelos in favour of his brother Alexios III. The deposed emperor's son, Alexios IV Angelos, asked the Crusaders to help him take back the throne of Constantinople. In return, the prince swore that he would give the Crusaders silver and troops for their expedition to Egypt, and he would place the Eastern Orthodox Byzantine Empire under the jurisdiction of the Catholic Pope. Although some Crusaders were reluctant to attack yet another Christian city, the main body of the army agreed. Constantinople was a tough nut to crack, surrounded by high walls and water on three sides, but the Crusaders attacked the city from both land and sea. After breaking the great chain that normally prevented ships from entering Constantinople's harbour, the Crusaders breached the walls and captured the city. Although the Crusaders were supposed to retire peacefully and head to Egypt when they did not immediately get paid for their efforts due to a popular uprising, they sacked Constantinople instead. Constantinople and large parts of Greece fell into the Latin Christians' hands, breaking up the once mighty Byzantine Empire and leaving it in ruins. Treasures from ancient Greece and Rome, which had long been on display in the city, were pilfered and transported across Europe, and many Western Christians saw the attack as a shameful event that had been fueled by greed. After the disgraceful events of the Fourth Crusade, the mania for crusading declined significantly in Europe. The Crusades that followed the Fourth Crusade are not very well known and generally regarded as an expensive waste of time. The Fifth Crusade was fought mainly by Hungarian and Austrian soldiers who marched on Egypt, attacking cities along the Nile to seize Cairo. Early in the war, the Crusaders were offered Jerusalem by the Ayyubid leader Al-Kamil in exchange for peace. The Crusaders refused this offer, confident they could achieve great things, but after a modest victory at the city of Damietta, they were easily defeated. The Sixth Crusade, which occurred a few years later, was led by the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, who had recently married the heiress of Jerusalem, Isabella II. This crusade was won with no fighting, as once again, Al-Kamil offered the Crusaders the city of Jerusalem in exchange for peace. A delighted Frederick II accepted the offer and was crowned king in the city in 1229 before heading home to Germany. Frederick's diplomatic success was short-lived, however, and by 1244, Jerusalem was back in Muslim hands. This led to the launch of the Seventh and Eighth Crusades, known as the Crusades of Louis IX, King of France. These conflicts achieved absolutely nothing, but the fanatically religious Louis was very devoted to the cause. Louis himself was captured and ransomed in Egypt during the disastrous Seventh Crusade, and during the Eighth Crusade, Louis was killed by a bout of dysentery that ravaged his army in 1270. The Ninth and final crusade was an expedition led by Lord Edward, who would one day be the formidable King Edward I of England. Edward headed to the Holy Land in 1271. Intent on following the now-dead King Louis, his expedition lasted less than a year, as he was forced to return home to deal with more pressing matters in England. As Western Europe's enthusiasm for crusading gradually dwindled, the remaining states of Outremer were slowly picked off one by one. The last Crusader stronghold, the city of Acre, was captured by the Mamluks. It had ultimately proved too difficult and too costly for the Crusaders to hold cities in the Levant. Surrounded by hostile empires, kings who had issues in their own lands typically could not stay so far from home for long periods, and frequent conflicts in Western Europe made crusading seem unattractive in the long term. The Crusades had little effect on the Middle East. Their real legacy was, ironically, the destruction of the Byzantine Empire that the Crusaders had sworn initially to protect.